Think back to the home your grandparents lived in during the mid-1960s. Close your eyes for just a moment and walk through it. The smell of wood polish on the banister. The particular weight of a telephone receiver pulled from a wall-mounted cradle. The sound of a percolator working through its cycle on a kitchen counter that was never quite clean and never quite dirty. The heavy floral wallpaper in the hallway, the kind with raised texture you could run your fingertip along and feel each petal separately. The specific quality of afternoon light through net curtains that made every room feel as though it existed slightly outside of ordinary time. We look back at those years as an era of pure innocence. Quiet streets. Unlocked doors. Neighbors who knew your name and your business and showed up with food when something went wrong. And we are not entirely wrong to remember it that way. But every home has its secrets. And some secrets are not hidden because they are shameful. Some are hidden because the person carrying them had no other choice. In the spring of 2019, a family in central Ohio began the process of clearing out the home their grandmother had lived in since 1965. Clara Vance had been moved to a care facility the previous autumn, at the age of 87, after a fall in the kitchen that her sons had decided, quickly, and without much visible grief, was reason enough to sell the house. The property had been on the market less than 3 weeks when a young couple made an offer. The sons accepted it the same afternoon it arrived. They did not ask Clara. By that point, most of them had stopped asking Clara anything. The new owners began their renovations in April. They were the kind of people who document everything, who film themselves pulling up carpet and peeling back wallpaper and knocking on walls to hear what the house has to say for itself. And on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of April, behind the vintage kitchen pantry where Clara had kept her tinned goods for 54 years, one of them knocked on a section of wall that did not sound like the others. What they found behind it was not immediately dramatic. A small recess, roughly the size of a filing cabinet, built into the original structure of the house and sealed behind a false panel that had been papered over so carefully and so long ago that the wallpaper pattern matched perfectly, the kind of concealment that takes planning, and patience, and a very specific reason to bother. Inside the recess was a heavy iron safe, dial combination, no bigger than a large suitcase. It took a locksmith 4 hours to open it. Inside were 12 items. And by the time the new owners had laid all 12 of them out on Clara's kitchen table, the same table she had eaten every meal at for 54 years, they understood that the house they had just bought had belonged to a woman they would never meet, who had lived a life that nobody in her family had ever known about. The house Clara Vance moved into in 1965 was a 3-bedroom timber frame property on a quiet residential street in Medina County, Ohio. She was 33 years old. Her husband Gerald was 38, a foreman at a local manufacturing plant, a man described by neighbors in the years that followed as quiet, reliable, and not particularly curious about anything that happened inside the house he came home to each evening. They had 3 sons, the oldest 7, the youngest just turned 4. The house cost $11,200, financed over 20 years through a federally backed mortgage that was issued in Gerald's name alone because that was simply how mortgages worked in 1965. Clara had grown up in rural Kentucky, the daughter of a tobacco farmer who had lost most of what he owned in the Depression years and spent the rest of his life making sure his children understood that security was something you built for yourself, quietly, without telling anyone you were building it. That lesson had stayed with Clara in ways that her family would not discover until a locksmith spent 4 hours on a combination dial in April 2019. The 1965 American home was in many ways the most fully equipped domestic space that had ever existed. The post-war manufacturing boom had filled it with appliances, products, and conveniences that would have seemed like science fiction to the women who ran households during the war years. The refrigerator had replaced the icebox. The automatic washing machine had replaced the mangle. The vacuum cleaner, the electric iron, the gas range, all of them available, all of them affordable on a foreman's salary, all of them making the physical labor of running a home faster and less exhausting than it had ever been before. And filling the medicine cabinet, the kitchen cupboards and the tool shed of that 1965 home was a range of products that were considered completely safe, completely normal, and completely unremarkable. 12 items in total, laid out on her kitchen table by strangers who had no idea what they were looking at. Let us open them now. Item 1. A glass bottle of mercurochrome. The first item the new owners lifted from the safe was a small glass bottle, dark amber, with a rubber-tipped applicator still attached to the inside of the screw cap. The label read mercurochrome. If you grew up in America before 1998, you know this bottle. You almost certainly had it applied to your knees at some point by a parent or grandparent who held your leg still with one hand and painted the wound bright red with the other. Item 2. A tin of DDT household powder. The second item was a pale green tin approximately the size of a talcum powder container, with a perforated top for dusting. It was a household DDT powder, manufactured in 1962, and it was completely unopened. DDT was not a fringe or industrial product in 1965. It was sold in hardware stores, supermarkets, and pharmacies across America as a standard domestic insecticide. Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring changed everything, though not immediately and not completely. By 1965 the scientific evidence against DDT was building, but the product was still legal, still widely available and still sitting in millions of American homes. It was not banned in the United States until 1972, and its effects on bird populations, ecosystems, and human health are still being studied more than 50 years later. Item 3. A booklet of Quaalude prescriptions. The third item was a small prescription booklet held together with a rubber band that had long since lost most of its elasticity. The prescriptions were for methaqualone, sold under the brand name Quaalude, and they were made out to a name that was not Clara Vance. The name on the prescriptions was Margaret Holloway. Quaaludes were legal prescription sedatives through the 1960s and into the 1970s, prescribed widely by American physicians as sleeping tablets and anxiety medication. They were considered safe, effective, and entirely respectable, the kind of medication a family doctor would prescribe to a woman who was not sleeping well, which in 1965 covered a significant proportion of the women in any given suburb. They were withdrawn from the U.S. market in 1985 after decades of misuse, dependency issues, and association with sexual assault, and they have been a Schedule I controlled substance ever since. Item 4. A Sears catalog order form for a prefabricated house. The fourth item was a single folded sheet of paper, a printed order form from the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog, creased along its folds with the particular softness of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times. It was an order form for a prefabricated house. Item 5. A book of S&H green stamps. The fifth item was a small booklet, roughly the size of a passport, its pages filled from the first to the last with neat rows of small green stamps, each one licked and pressed into place with the kind of patient thoroughness that speaks of a person with a long-term plan. It was a completed book of S&H green stamps, and it had never been redeemed. S&H green stamps were the loyalty reward system of mid-century America, the physical, paper ancestor of every points program and cashback scheme that exists today. Introduced in the 1930s and reaching peak popularity through the 1950s and 1960s, they were issued by supermarkets, petrol stations, and retail stores at a rate of roughly 1 stamp per 10 cents spent. You collected them in booklets, filled the booklets, and redeemed them at S&H redemption centers for household goods from a catalog that at its peak in 1964 was the single largest catalog published in the United States. The stamps themselves expired decades ago. The S&H company stopped issuing them in the 1980s. Clara's 14 completed books are worth nothing today except as artifacts of a domestic economy that no longer exists. But she had saved them anyway, with the same careful patience she had applied to everything else in that safe. Item 6. A glass vial of ether. The sixth item was a small sealed glass vial, approximately 4 inches long, with a cork stopper sealed with wax. The label identified the contents as diethyl ether, laboratory grade, purchased in 1964. Diethyl ether was available for purchase at American hardware stores and pharmacies through the mid-1960s as a general-purpose solvent and engine starter. Today diethyl ether is a DEA List I controlled chemical, meaning its purchase requires federal registration and its use is monitored by the Drug Enforcement Administration. In 1964 you could buy it with cash from a hardware store and carry it home in a paper bag. Clara had bought 1 vial and put it in her safe and nobody who knew her had ever known she owned it. What she intended to do with it, or what she had already done with it, the vial did not say. Item 7. A handwritten letter to Robert. The seventh item was an envelope. Unsealed, unaddressed, containing a single sheet of paper covered on both sides in Clara's handwriting. The letter began, "Dear Robert." It was dated November 1963. It was signed at the bottom of the second page not with the name Clara, and not with the name Margaret, but with a third name entirely, Eleanor. The letter had never been sent. Robert, whoever he was, had never read it. The new owners read it standing at Clara's kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon in April 2019, and they did not share its contents publicly out of a respect for the family that the family itself had arguably not earned. What they said, when they described it later, was that it answered 1 question and opened 3 more. And that reading it felt like something that should not have been possible, like hearing a voice from a room you had been told was empty. Item 8. A photograph. The 8th item was a photograph, black and white, approximately 3 inches by 4, with the slightly soft focus of an amateur camera from the late 1950s. It showed a young woman, clearly Clara, perhaps 24 or 25 years old, standing in front of a house that was not the Medina County house and not any house that anyone in her family recognized. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at something to the left of the frame with an expression that the new owners described, carefully and precisely, as the expression of someone who does not yet know that what they are looking at is about to end. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, were two things: a town name, Harlan, Kentucky, and a date, 1956. Clara had married Gerald Vance in 1958. The photograph was taken 2 years before her marriage, in a town in eastern Kentucky, in front of a house that nobody in her family had ever heard her mention. She had kept it for 63 years inside a combination safe behind a false wall. Whatever Harlan, Kentucky represented in Clara Vance's life, it was not something she had been willing to leave behind, and not something she had been willing to let anyone find. Item 9. A marriage certificate. The 9th item was a folded document, legal size, official in the particular way that government printed forms from the 1950s were official: heavy paper, clear typeface, a county seal embossed in one corner. It was a marriage certificate. It was not the certificate from Clara's 1958 marriage to Gerald Vance. It was a certificate from a 1955 marriage in Harlan County, Kentucky, between a woman named Eleanor Mae Combs and a man named Thomas Ray Holloway. The wife's date of birth on the certificate matched Clara Vance's date of birth exactly. The signatures matched. Eleanor Mae Combs was Clara. Thomas Ray Holloway was not Gerald. And Margaret Holloway, the name on the Quaalude prescriptions, was no longer a mystery. Item 10. The cloth bag. The 10th item was small enough to sit in the palm of a hand. A cloth bag, the kind that might once have held lavender or dried herbs, its drawstring pulled tight and knotted. Inside it were two things: a small collection of baby teeth, 8 of them, the new owners counted, and a single lock of hair, tied with a piece of white thread, the color of the hair distinctly, unmistakably red. Every known member of Clara Vance's family had dark hair. Her sons, their children, the photographs that lined the walls of the house, dark hair, every one of them. The lock in the cloth bag was red. It had been cut from the head of a child who did not appear in any photograph on any wall of Clara Vance's house. And it had been kept, for longer than most people alive today have been living, inside a combination safe, in a cloth bag small enough to sit in the palm of a hand. 2 items remain. And the last 2 are the reason Clara built the wall in the first place. Item 11. The letter. The 11th item was a sealed envelope. The paper was newer than anything else in the safe, the handwriting slightly less steady but still distinctly Clara's. On the front, in her careful script, "For whoever finds this first, I am sorry." Inside were 2 pages. The new owners have never shared the full contents. What they have said, in the account they gave later, is that Clara explained everything. Thomas Holloway. Robert. The red hair. Harlan, Kentucky, and what happened there in the winter of 1957. The name Eleanor and why she had stopped using it. The Quaalude prescriptions and whose name she had used to fill them and why. The ether and what she had considered doing with it during one specific winter that she named. The Sears catalog form and the savings and what she had been planning before she decided, in 1962, that leaving was no longer the right answer. She explained all of it. 2 pages. 50 years of concealment reduced to 2 pages written by an old woman who had decided, at some point in her final years in that house, that whoever came after her deserved to know that the walls had been listening. Item 12. The key. The 12th and final item was a key. Small, brass, the kind used for a safe deposit box rather than a door. Attached to it by a short length of wire was a paper tag, written in Clara's handwriting. A bank name. A town name 200 miles from Medina County, Ohio. She kept her letters and her photographs and her name and her history and a lock of red hair in a place where nobody could reach them. And then she lived her assigned life so thoroughly and so warmly and so completely that 54 years passed before anyone thought to knock on the wall. That is not a story about secrets. That is a story about survival. And it deserves to be told with exactly the respect Clara Vance could not be given while she was alive to receive it. And inside that house, in a room or a box or a space that nobody has thought to look yet, is the part of someone's life that the life they were living did not have room for. We will not always find it in time. We will not always know what to do with it when we do. But we can do one thing, starting tonight, that the locked safe and the false wall and the 54 years of silence are asking us to do. We can ask the women in our lives, the ones who always have something ready when we arrive, the ones who show up without being asked, the ones who listen as though we are the only thing worth listening to. We can ask them how they are. Not as a greeting. As a question. The kind that expects a real answer and is willing to wait for one. Clara Vance spent 54 years waiting for someone to knock on the right wall. Echo of Yesterday has more of this to find. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who knew a woman like Clara. And come back next week.